Hello, and welcome to the It Depends podcast. I, as always, am your host, Kevin Goldsmith. I am a Chief Technology Officer. I have been a VP of Engineering, Director of Engineering, Engineering Manager, and of course, a developer for many, many years. And this will be the last time I get to say it. This year, I published my first book. That book is called It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership from 2012 to 2022. And in this podcast, every other week, we serialize the audiobook of the book. There is also a newsletter. The newsletter serializes the print of the book, and it appears on the weeks that the podcast does not appear. So you can subscribe to both. I recommend you do. And you'll get different content because the newsletter serializes the book out of order, and the podcast serializes the book in order. And that's because each of these chapters is a separate article or blog post I wrote during those 10 years. Another way, and a faster way, to get all the content is to buy the book. And if you're interested in buying the book, you can go to your local bookstore. You can go to your favorite online bookstore, of course. There's a set of links from itdependsbook.net, and that has links to a lot of the online stores. The book's available in hardcover, softcover, ebook, and of course, audiobook. So please feel free. If you have a book budget for learning or something from your company, now is a great time to spend whatever's left of it or get started on next year's in the beginning of January. Appreciate those of you who bought it. A lot of you have, and I'm very grateful for that. As I said, it's my first book, and so I'm trying to get the word out. Speaking of blog posts, this week published a new blog post that I'll direct your attention to called The CTO's Guide to Crafting a Technology Leadership Resume. Kind of a wordy title, I know, but it's essentially the result of me very recently, over the last several weeks, going through a process of reviewing resumes for people I mentor and just helping them looking for a new role. And just some things that brought up for me, because when you have to explain something to somebody, you're looking at how they laid out their resume and you're talking to them about what you think works and what doesn't work. It just reminds you of all this stuff that's in your head that you wouldn't be thinking it through unless you were having this conversation. So as I was doing, I was reminding myself of all these things and then turned that into a blog post. If you're considering a new role or going to be looking for a new role in the new year, or you just want to keep your resume up to date, maybe clean it up, I have to admit, I haven't always been the best at that. Every once in a while, I'll go and look at it again and go, wow, okay, I need to update some things. So I do it from time to time, but I'm not doing it constantly. But after having written this blog post, maybe that'll be one of my sort of end of the year projects, is to go through my resume again and my LinkedIn and just make sure that I'm following my own suggestions, because I have to admit, I don't always think about it. I think about it when I'm looking at other people's things, not always when I'm looking at my own. Also, another thing for the end of the year would be there's a survey I've mentioned the last few episodes. I would really appreciate getting some more responses. I've gotten some, and for those of you who have, thank you very much. We are now on chapter 27 of 36, so not that many episodes left in this run of the podcast. And one of the things I'm thinking about, especially now as I start thinking through what I want to accomplish next year, is what happens when we reach the end. Do I continue to do the podcast? Do I continue to do the newsletter? What do I put into them? What would you like to hear more of? I've gotten some good suggestions. Thank you. And where do we go from here? I'm not ready to publish another book yet, so I can't immediately jump into the next book. But I've heard from people that they find this valuable, that they get information through the podcast, through the newsletter that helps them in their work. And so I'd like to continue to provide value to all of you. Just thinking it through, thinking what I want to do from here, your input, very valuable to that process. The survey is linked from the show notes. It's also linked from itdependsbook.net. You can always contact me if you have questions, if you have comments, concerns, whatever. You can reach me at contact@itdependsbook.net. It Depends Book, one word. This chapter, and I know I say this a lot, this chapter, a very popular one. This article, this blog post became my first widely read, widely shared, still is one of the top posts because it's talking about the Spotify model. We talked about that in the last episode, and I told you we were going to talk about it again. This was published in 2014, so it was right as that model was becoming exceptionally popular. Reading it again, and obviously I've read it multiple times preparing the book, it's amazing to me how short it is because I often point people to it to explain to them why they don't want to do the Spotify model in their companies. This was written very directly as a response to people approaching me, people I knew from other companies, people I knew from companies I worked at before, people who were trying to implement the Spotify model based on very little information. Basically, at that point, there was just the white paper. So people read a 3-page, it's not very long, it's 3 or 4 pages, white paper about the Spotify model, and then we're trying to implement it at their companies. And it was a mixture of people approaching me and talking to me about it. It was a mixture of people not understanding it, which makes sense because there wasn't a ton of information. And so implementing it very wrongly. What was much more common was they took their existing structures, usually kind of hierarchical command and control structures, and just mapped Spotify names onto those things. So engineering managers became chapter leads, but they still managed a team directly. They didn't create full stack teams. That has become very common now. I would say partly thanks to Spotify, but Spotify wasn't the only company that came up with this innovation. But full stack teams, they weren't doing that. So they had a chapter lead of the backend services team, which was just doing backend services. And that person was still directing the team, which is not what the chapter lead does. All those kinds of things. They were just taking the words. It happens a lot. You see this in Agile a lot too. You take the word, you apply it to whatever you're doing, and you say, we're doing this new thing and it's going to be much better. And of course it isn't because you haven't changed anything. You're just calling things by new names. So at this point, I was already starting to get some of that kind of backlash of, we tried the Spotify model, it didn't work. And then when I talked to the people, it's like, no, you didn't do the Spotify model. You just did exactly what you were doing, or you implemented one thing without getting the rest of it, and then said it doesn't work because it didn't work for you. I said this in the last episode. I'll say this. I probably said this a few other times already. Yeah, it works great. It worked exceptionally well. I wouldn't have written about it. I wouldn't have talked about it if it didn't work. I lived it for years. I saw it scale. I joined the company. There was maybe 450, something like that, engineers. So it scaled well. By the time I left, there was about 800 engineers, all working in this model. We were coordinating across multiple continents, multiple engineering offices. We did have challenges, and a lot of that's cultural. So I mentioned at the very end of this chapter, I mentioned some of the challenges with implementing the Spotify model in your company. And those challenges are, Spotify had a unique culture. And that culture was very Swedish, having lived in Sweden. It reflected the Swedish attitude towards teams. Sweden's not the only country in the world that kind of has that culture around teams, but not many countries have that culture. The Spotify model of team accountability, as opposed to the command and control model of that single ringable neck or that kind of single point of accountability, I was the single point of accountability for my tribe. Everybody in the end reported to me. So I was that single ringable neck for what ended up being about 175 people. But that was it. Each team worked together. Each team was jointly accountable. If somebody wasn't doing the work, that would come to their manager, who is a chapter lead, who might not be in that team to manage. It'd be handled by the coach, sometimes working with the chapter lead, and sometimes it was the team. oftentimes it was the team that would say, hey, what's going on? You're holding us back. And it really was that kind of shared accountability model. A lot of companies just didn't have an understanding of that, or they would try to do it. There are companies who tried to do it, that they didn't have a culture of that. So this is one area, I don't know if I wrote about it or not. I've certainly talked about it. The US had unique challenges with the Spotify model that the Swedish team didn't have. And that was because the US is not a team-oriented culture. It is a very individual-oriented culture, which meant that people didn't like that their success was part of a team. The teams it was successful. Individuals certainly contributed to that, and that was recognized throughout the whole company. But really, your goal was to make your team be successful, not to make yourself. And I'm an American saying this, right? But I could see that was a bit of more of a challenge. That kind of joint accountability model was a bit more of a challenge in the US. They still did it, but it wasn't as natural. We had to work a lot harder at it in the US. It didn't go as deep. It didn't take as well. And I think another challenge, and one of the reasons why, as I said in the last episode, Spotify doesn't do the Spotify model anymore as a company, is because when I joined, a lot of the product managers had been developers. They were developers who switched into product, which meant that they were also, a lot of them had already been working as developers in this model. As Spotify became more successful, as Spotify could now attract really great product talent from other companies, Spotify started to hire product managers from lots of other companies where they came from command and control, hierarchical style management, where they were used to peering with an engineering leader at every level. They were very uncomfortable. I had multiple conversations with product leaders who had joined the company and didn't like this notion that they didn't have a single person to talk to that was a peer on the engineering side. And to their credit, certainly to the people I worked with, a lot of them tried. A lot of them tried really hard to kind of figure it out. It was never comfortable for them, but they gave it a shot and they tried to make it work. But it was still a challenge, to be fair. And that is, as that company grew and brought in more people and expanded to more geographies, as you become a more successful company, you can hire in all these people from all these other companies that work in very traditional ways. And now these people aren't choosing to come work for Spotify because it works in this way. When I went to Spotify, it wasn't Spotify. It was a music streamer similar to many others. And it wasn't much bigger than any of the others at that point. What attracted me to the company was this way of working. That's why I went to go work at Spotify. That's why I moved my family to another continent to go work for this company, because I was so excited that when they shared that white paper with me, which I'd never seen, because when they were interviewing me, nobody knew about it, and I started to understand how they were working, I said, I have to be there. I have to see what this is really like from the inside. That's what brought me to the company. If you joined Spotify in 2017, 2018, after I left, or even 2016 when I was there, you might be coming from a Google or a Facebook, where you're going not to go work in this squad's tribe saying you're going to go work for the world's largest streaming music company, because that's what Spotify became. And you're not choosing to be part of that culture. You're choosing to be part of the company. You may accept that you have to work in this way, but it's never natural. And you're always going to start pushing towards what's familiar to you. And I think that is part of the reason, not because the model itself ceased to function or ceased to scale. One of the things that we worked on while I was there was the challenge of continuing to scale the model. We introduced another layer. So when this article was written, there was squads and tribes. I reported to the CTO. While I was there, my tribe was growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was to the point of realizing, me and my peers, we are hitting the limits of scaling within a tribe. and we need to create another level, another layer. We introduced that in 2015. We had another layer above tribes so that we could continue to organize it, because otherwise we would have just kept splitting tribes into smaller tribes, but we would have ended up with way too many people in the senior leadership level. So that was one of the changes. I talked about it in a conference talk, but I don't even think that got around. That was designed, and we did it very consciously. We did everything very consciously and very deliberately. That new layer was designed to scale the engineering team another 5-6x. It should have worked okay. At the same time, as I said, you had all these people coming in. They weren't joining the company because of the Spotify model. They're joining the company because they wanted to work at Spotify and didn't really care that much about the model. That's one of the things that I think eventually led the company away from using the model in the same way it did. It still uses aspects of it. I know that because obviously I still know people there, but it's very different from when I was there, and that's okay. The other part of the model was that it was very flexible, and I talk about that a little bit in the chapter. Each team was doing their own thing, and that was by design. Each team was autonomous. It is an autonomous team model because each team was full stack, had no dependencies on other teams, which meant they could do their own thing. So that led to a lot of velocity, a lot of teams working in parallel, not having to sync up a lot, which had been my experience, even building in an agile way, but building in an agile way at Adobe, which was great at a team level on doing agile. I was there 9 years. The first several years I was there, we were still shipping plastic discs. It was still the Creative Suite. It was before Creative Cloud. And so there was a deadline, just like I talked about at Microsoft in the first chapter. There was a deadline. We were all trying to meet that deadline. My team was working with several of the products. We worked with Photoshop and Premiere and After Effects, others, Flash later, but they were all going towards shipping on a plastic disc. The date was decided pretty much. And they had milestones. They had places they needed to be. My team was a dependency on all these big products, which meant we could do all the agile we wanted, but we still had to hit these milestones. Spotify had the benefit of being cloud first. So that meant that constraint around dates was gone and coordination around that. But because it was an autonomous team model, each team could be working on its own timeline. And I'll say the other part that probably doesn't get spoken about enough is that a lot of the infrastructure, one of the reasons why the infrastructure team was so big, it was the largest team, as I talk about in this chapter, was because it had to support all of these squads shipping independently. And we even figured out ways to do as much shipping of the apps independently as well. And this would be for some of the technology that exists today that lets you update over the air, aside from installation in the App Store. We had to build our own versions of that. And we did, because the most important thing was to reduce the amount of synchronization that happened. And having a feature ship on all platforms simultaneously, or be able to be shipped on all platforms simultaneously, would have meant that everybody was waiting for the mobile apps to both be approved, because we had Android and iOS, before we could ship a feature, and that was just too long. And while I was there, we went from, I think, monthly to bi-weekly to weekly releases into the App Store, and that was still too long. It was considered too long to wait, and no one liked having that bottleneck. So we not only engineered the organization, but we engineered the architectures of the mobile apps and the web and the desktop app to make it possible to ship as frequently as we possibly could, daily. And some teams were shipping multiple times a day, and that was great. And that was the idea. Ship as fast as you can, few dependencies as possible. And that is the genius of the Spotify model. It's a great model to work in. If you're a developer, you're part of an autonomous team, you have a lot of control over the way you work, you have a lot of control over the features that you work on. You're not working with other teams and constantly waiting on them and any of that kind of stuff. So, in that autonomy, mastery, and purpose triumvirate from Daniel Pink, this is by far the most sort of autonomous model of any organizational structure I've seen. And purpose is clear because it's obvious what you're doing. And because your team is shipping directly to users, you get to see how it's working. You're not part of some widget that goes into a bigger widget, that goes into a bigger thing, that goes into a bigger thing that someday, far into the future, a person will see. You can get that kind of direct feedback. So those two parts of that trio were autonomy and purpose were very clear. And mastery is kind of up to you, but that's also what your chapter lead is for, is to help you develop that mastery, and the guild as well. While I'm here, I will talk about, and I've just mentioned guilds, I'll talk about that real quick. I left Spotify 8 years ago, almost 9 now. I still see aspects of the Spotify model in lots of places. When I talk to different companies, when I talk to other leaders, two things I see most commonly. One is that calling a team a squad. I don't know if that predated the Spotify model. I never liked that. Most of the people at Spotify, or the people who chose that word, weren't super fond of it either. It was just a word they picked. But somehow a team being a squad, even if your team doesn't work that way, the Spotify way, that stuck for some reason. That kind of full stack team thing, generally, I'll talk about that in a second, has really taken on. You see full stack teams lots of places now. And that has often meant a matrix, even if it's not like a chapter tribe type of matrix like Spotify, but the fact that you'll have testers, developers, maybe back end, front end, designer, whatever, that whole thing, but with different managers, but being in the same team. That's a matrix model, even if it's not necessarily the Spotify way of doing a matrix. That has become quite common. But probably by far the most common thing I've seen is guilds. I don't know if it predated Spotify. I guess if your company had kind of social clubs or whatever, book club or whatever, that is a guild. We certainly had guilds that were more that kind of thing, but that kind of cross-team way to get to know people on other teams and do all that kind of stuff, that is a artifact of Spotify, or at least Spotify really popularized it. And I see lots of companies have that today. And it'll either be what you might have called prior to that, like a community of purpose, like a bunch of people who do similar jobs in different teams get together and talk. That was an extremely valuable thing at Spotify. It was a great way when you have all these autonomous teams all doing their own thing, trying to go as fast as possible. You do want to share best practices, and you do want to share good ideas, and you do want to make sure that people are approaching things in a similar way, even if they're not doing them in the exact same way. And guilds were excellent at that. And so I am very encouraged, actually, that of all the things that companies have taken away or adopted or have just become best practices in the industry, guilds are a great one. One thing I'll also say, which is really interesting to me, is that naming thing. I've talked about this in the past. One of the geniuses, intentional or unintentional, it was unintentional, but one of the geniuses of that Spotify model is that they invented new names for things. And because of that it ended up being branded in a very serious way. When I go to a company and they tell me they have chapters, which I've had companies do, I go, oh, okay. So that means something to me, certainly because I worked at Spotify, but it means something to me just as somebody familiar with that model. And then they tell me chapters are something different than what I would expect. I go, well, that's not a chapter, because these words are very specific and they don't really predate that Spotify model. Like I said, a lot of companies call their teams squads. I'm now kind of used to it because I've heard it so much. But certainly at first, when they would tell me, oh, we have squad, hey, you should go look at this squad. I go, oh, cool, you have squads. So you do X, Y, Z. And they go, no, we don't do any of that. And I'm like, well, why are you calling your team squad? It's called a team. Like, why are you using this word that has some meaning? And I've also seen companies like ING. I visited ING. A lot of people from Spotify visited ING, and they took the Spotify model very much as an influence, and they did a whole thing on it. They did their own take on it, which is what in this chapter I tell you to do. You shouldn't do the Spotify model. You should do something for your company But when ING did that, they used all the Spotify words. So like they had tribes that were 400 people. Spotify would never have a tribe that's 400 people. Why? Because it's bigger than Dunbar's number. The tribe was specifically limited to be no bigger than Dunbar's number because that's the number of people you could actually know. You're supposed to know everyone in your tribe, or at least be able to know everyone in your tribe. Well, that's one of the reasons why when my tribe became 175 people, the first impulse was to split it, even before then, because it was getting hard to manage for me. But my boss, the CTO, didn't want more direct reports. I couldn't just promote somebody in the tribe to be a tribe leader of this new tribe, and now we both report to the CTO. This is one of the reasons, as I said, that necessitated us creating that additional level in the hierarchy. When ING took the Spotify ideas, expanded upon them or made them appropriate for ING, but then wrote a bunch of their own white papers and blog posts where they talk about what they did, but they use the Spotify words, that just meant to everyone, okay, well, they're just doing Spotify, as opposed to saying they're doing ING. And in some people's minds now, like depending on what you read first, you start to think Spotify did ING when it was really the other way around. So if you are trying to do something unique, if you're trying to do something novel in your company, you're adopting a new framework, you're building your own framework, you're building your own way of scaling, you're doing your own thing, which kudos, please do. Use your own words, make up new words, find new words that won't be confused with other things. Part of the reason why Spotify created squads and tribes and guilds, they're all just teams, but all of a sudden every person is now in like 10 teams. And that doesn't make any sense. So they had to come up with unique words to differentiate between these different teams. Because it's turtles all the way down, it was teams all the way down. And so that's why they did it. But now they have these words. Now, when you say these words, you're talking about Spotify, except now these words, as I said, have become a little bit generic or vague, which is unfortunate. Companies, if you're doing something novel, if you're doing something unique, give it a new name. Not only because if you eventually talk about it or tell people about it, they know, they trace it back to your company. That's branding. But also, so nobody confuses what you're doing with what somebody else is doing. Because words have meaning, people have assumptions about a word if it's already been defined by somebody else. So make up your own names for stuff. Real quick example about giving names to new things. After I left Spotify, I became the CTO of Avo. And there's a separate chapter in the book about journey teams at Avo. Of course, I was coming straight from Spotify. I was influenced a lot by that. Avo was a scaling company. The existing kind of hierarchical model was starting to get challenged. There were way too many managers in tech. We ended up creating a matrix organization with groups that were organized around different parts of the product, different user journeys, and with sub-teams within them that were very dynamic, very much influenced by Spotify, but not Spotify. Definitely not the Spotify model. But I had engineering managers with people on multiple teams. I had small dynamic teams within a larger kind of fixed team that had a clear mission and purpose. Very similar, very much influenced by Spotify, but not the Spotify model. And for that reason, those teams were not called tribes or squads, or the sub-teams weren't called squads. We called them journey teams because I wanted to differentiate. If I called them tribes, people would assume they worked in a certain way. They didn't. So that's one of the things. There's a whole chapter on journey teams in the book, and I have talks about it. I would recommend that you check those out if you're interested, and how somebody coming out of the Spotify model took some of those ideas and applied them in a different context. I still am influenced by those. Of course I am. If you look at how we organize stuff at DistroKid today, it's very different than Spotify. But some of those ideas, some of those things that worked well there that I want to work well for us, very much are a part of that. The core ideas, still carrying them forward. But of course, I'm always applying them in a way that's specific to the company. I talked a bit about that in the last episode. So I gave you a lot of context around this chapter. If you're more interested, if you want to follow up more on kind of hearing me talk about specifically around Spotify model, if you look on my personal site, kevingoldsmith.com, on my resume page, very appropriate if you read the blog post, in there is a list of interviews with links to them. You'll see lots of, especially around 2016 to 2019, 2020, there's a lot of people that really want to talk to me about that Spotify model and what worked and what didn't. So you can find a lot of interviews with me talking a lot about it from various podcasts and stuff if you're interested. And I'll link to that in the show notes as well. But now I present to you thoughts on emulating Spotify's matrix organization in other companies. This is chapter 27 from It Depends. Thoughts on emulating Spotify's matrix organization in other companies. Originally published on March 14th, 2014. I was in San Francisco in December of 2013 for a conference. While there, I connected with a few companies inspired by Henrik Nieberg and Anders Everson's white paper, Scaling Agile at Spotify, who'd been trying to implement some of these ideas in their own companies. I think Henrik's paper does an excellent job of describing the what and how, but it seems that the why and some critical ideas can get lost when others read it. If you haven't read Henrik's white paper, I suggest reading it before listening to the rest of this chapter. I will do a quick recap here in any case. Spotify's engineering and product organization, now over 600 people, is split into several large groups called tribes. Each tribe is responsible for a set of related features or engineering functions. For example, our largest tribe is the Infrastructure and Operations tribe, whose name is self-explanatory. I am the tribe lead of the Music Player tribe. We handle importing audio from our label and distribution partners, storing and streaming the music, search, collection, and playlists, artist pages, music metadata, and the music knowledge graph that supports things like the above, but also ads, discovery, radio, and the like. While the whole company works on the same product, Spotify, each tribe is set up to work as independently as possible. As you will hear, a critical aspect of our organizational model is to give autonomy at every level. This autonomy helps remove decision-making bottlenecks and unnecessary dependencies, which improves velocity. Each tribe is composed of squads. A squad is a team responsible for a single feature or component. For instance, among the teams, one is dedicated to handling searches, while another manages the A/B test infrastructure, among other specialized squads. We set up each tribe and squad to function as autonomously as possible. In the context of a feature development team, each must be full stack. A full stack team is responsible for both backend implementation as well as user interface implementation on all platforms. A typical feature squad would have web service engineers, iOS, Android, web, and desktop engineers, as well as testers, an agile coach, a product owner, and a UX designer. With this staffing, the squad has everything they need to implement anything related to their feature. They don't have to wait for another team to implement the necessary pieces. They also have autonomy and local decision-making ability, so there are few impediments to the speed of their execution. To this point, with tribes and squads described only, Spotify may seem like a traditional hierarchical engineering organization, but this is where the similarity ends. Unlike a traditional organization, a squad does not have a single engineering leader whom everyone on the team reports to. In fact, there's not a single leader for the squad. The product owner and UX designer collectively work with the engineers and testers to make decisions about their features. Spotify is not a no-manager culture, however. We strongly feel that managers have a role in supporting the people who work for them. Managers are essential as technical and career mentors and organizational communication conduits. Rather than have management hierarchies follow organizational ones, creating a de facto command and control structure, we instead have first-level managers responsible for technical functional areas across multiple squads. We call these reporting and functional groupings chapters. Again, as an example, reporting to me, the tribe lead, are chapter leads. In my tribe, there are currently 3 back-end services development chapters, 2 front-end development chapters, including all the UI developers, a core library chapter, and a test chapter. These 7 chapters span 8 different squads. Almost every chapter lead has reports in 2 squads, and a few have direct reports in 3. Nearly all chapter leads work within a team to some capacity as well, either as a developer or technical lead, and not necessarily within a squad with members of their chapter. This chapter squad matrix organization is critical to our organizational agility. It allows the squads and the tribe to be more fluid. We can spin up a new squad to take advantage of an opportunity or handle an issue without worrying about changing reporting structures. If a squad completes its goals and no longer has a reason to exist, we can dissolve it without punishing a manager. This variance is a significant difference to traditional hierarchy because it gives us much flexibility and helps us avoid the old political issues around empire building and resource contention. In addition to our tribe squads and chapters, we also have virtual organizations called guilds. Guilds are cross-tribe organizations centered on different technical or interest areas, and their membership is voluntary. The guilds serve as ways to promote cross-tribe collaboration and communication, especially around things like best practices. For instance, we have guilds dedicated to a range of areas, including web development, agile practices, leadership, and test automation, among others. The guilds foster developer-to-developer communication, which is one of the ways that we keep all these autonomous teams from going in entirely different directions. I want to give some more background about why we have implemented this organizational model at Spotify, elaborate on our goals for implementing it, and discuss the aspects of our culture that have been critical to its success. It is remarkable that the way we work inspires other companies. Still, if you implement only parts of the model or try to impose it on a very different corporate culture, you will have difficulty achieving the same level of success that we have had. If you are considering using the Spotify organizational model within your company, there are a few things that will be critical to your success. Our organizational model assumes that engineering uses agile methodologies. Our goals for autonomy mean that we do not prescribe any particular development framework that our squads must subscribe to. However, all of the teams use agile development methodologies. While we do our best to eliminate dependencies between squads and tribes, there will always be some, since we are all working on the same product. Any individual squad choosing to build using a traditional waterfall or other non-agile process would be unable to keep up with the rapidly changing teams around them. If they tried to impose some sort of process on other groups so that they could follow a longer-term development plan, they would start slowing down the rest of the organization. A critical requirement in making our organizational model work well is that the entire company works with and understands agile practices and processes. For example, while our legal team isn't doing Scrum or Kanban, they work with engineering teams that use agile methodologies. Having the entire corporation understand and agree with agile means that no line of business area impedes the speed of implementation. Think of this in terms of Amdahl's law applied to a development organization. Suppose your development teams work quickly in parallel, but marketing or legal does not support an agile approach. In that case, they will become a bottleneck that will slow down the overall speed of the company. Similarly, implementing this with just one team as a test in a larger engineering organization will be prone to issues. Traditional engineering organizations usually don't set themselves up for autonomy. Adding a single autonomous team within that web of dependencies will likely hamper and frustrate that team and skew the experiment's results. While I've mentioned autonomy in several places, I cannot understate its criticality. We must empower each squad to make their own decisions, encompassing features, the development model, infrastructure, and implementation. Every decision requiring outside approval means a delay that slows development. Each dictated implementation or infrastructure decision means a technology that doesn't fit the way the team works or something new to learn before the team can build. This autonomy is a challenge to coordination, but it isn't as bad as it might seem in practice. Best practices and technologies spread from team to team through avenues like guilds. Teams adopt these practices and technologies on their schedule or pioneer new ways of working if it makes it easier for them to deliver value to our customers and then spread their learnings to the other teams. Attempting to layer the tribe and squads model over a traditional reporting hierarchy would be very problematic. While we have many long-lived squads at Spotify, we are constantly creating and disbanding squads as new needs arise or the teams fulfill their missions. Squad membership will also ebb and flow as required by the needs of a squad's mission. Traditional hierarchical organizations are self-perpetuating, and restructuring them is very disruptive to the management chains and the individual team members. You would gain some of the benefits of the Spotify model by building full-stack teams in a traditional organizational hierarchy, but you would lose many of the overall speed benefits that we leverage with our matrix organization. In conclusion, if Spotify's organizational model inspires you and you desire to improve the speed of your product development, there are a few things you need to understand. Our model works because it is layered on top of our corporate culture. Our culture values autonomy, agile processes, democratic teams, and servant leadership, amongst other things. You can certainly take some of the ideas from how we work and apply them in your organization, but you may not get the same returns without the cultural underpinnings. As I said, it surprises me how short it is now. It's been a year since I recorded the audiobook, so I forgot how short it was. But given how short it is, it's amazing how often it's referenced, how many people link to it. So definitely one of my most popular, if not the most popular article I've written. Thanks again for listening. I hope you have a great year. And if you're hearing this before the end of the year, I hope you had great holidays or you are about to have great holidays. I hope you are doing your planning for next year, just as I am. And I'll link to those in the show notes as well, those articles about preparing and that personal strategy offsite. I tell all the people I mentor about it, trying to remind them that this is just a good practice no matter how you do it. It's personal. It depends on you. I hope you're looking forward to what's to come for this next year in your work and in your opportunity to be a good leader and to grow as a leader. And I will see you in 2 weeks here on the podcast, and I will see you next week in the newsletter. Have a good week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.